Thank you all for coming. If I could have everyone's attention. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming today. We have a wonderfully large crowd, which is a nice thing, so I hope people can fill in at the back there. There is also an overflow area outside in the atrium where you can watch the lecture on TV. So for the people who are at the back, you might be able to sort of stand at the back there, or there's an overflow area in the atrium just outside. I'm Ethan Rarick. I'm the director of the Robert T. Matsui Center for Politics and Public Service here at Cal. The Matsui Center is a tribute and a legacy to one of Cal's most distinguished alumni, Robert Matsui, who served in the House of Representatives for 26 years, representing the Sacramento area before his untimely passing in 2005. The Matsui Center does a variety of things, but I want to mention two of them. Today, we run internship programs for Cal students that provide political internships at the federal level, in state government in Sacramento, and in local government. So for Cal students who are here today, if you're interested in politics and in working in political internships, I hope you'll look into our programs. Our website is igs.berkeley.edu, so you can go to that website, or we have information on a table where you entered the room today, and I hope you'll pick up a brochure and look into our internship programs. The Matsui Center also brings in political practitioners so that the campus can be exposed to the real-world lessons of the policymaking community, and that is what we are doing here today as part of the 2013 Matsui Lecture. I want to say thank you to a couple of people or groups of people. Since we began the Matsui Center 4 years ago, we've received tremendous support from Robert Matsui's widow and his successor in the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Doris Matsui. She also is a Cal alumni and has been a steadfast supporter of ours. Ann Sanger from her office is here today. Ann, thank you for coming, and please pass along to Congresswoman Matsui our tremendous thanks for all that she's done for us. I also know that we have Cal students here today, so we're always glad to see students here. We also have some hopefully prospective Cal students in that we have a group from Berkeley High School here today. So thank you guys for coming. It's nice to see some connection between the university and the city of Berkeley, and hopefully one day you'll be able to come back and maybe stay for 4 years. I want to thank the co-sponsors of today's lecture. In addition to the Matsui Center and the Institute of Governmental Studies, which is our parent organization, this lecture is co-sponsored by the Masters of Development Practice Program, the Institute of International Studies, the Institute of East Asian Studies, and the Blum Center for Developing Economies. So my thanks to them as well. A couple of logistical points. There will be time for question and answer after the congressman is done speaking. I will come back up, and there will be some microphones. We'll just ask people to raise their hands, and we'll pick out questioners. Please wait for the microphone to reach you before asking your question. We are recording this for webcast, so in order that they may hear your question, please wait for the microphone to get there. After the lecture, there will be a reception just outside the hall in the atrium. Hope you'll join us then, have some refreshments, and also have an opportunity to chat a bit with Congressman Bereuter. Today's speaker, Douglas Bereuter, was born and raised in Nebraska. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Nebraska, and then he went on to take graduate degrees in both city planning and public administration from Harvard, also known as the Berkeley of the East. He served one term in the Nebraska State Legislature, and then in 1978, he was elected to Congress in a congressional class that included Robert Matsui and some other notable figures such as Newt Gingrich and Dick Cheney were both in that class as well. Congressman Bereuter represented the eastern portion of Nebraska, and he ended up serving 26 years in the House of Representatives until 2004. He was particularly known, and this is relevant to today's conversation, he was particularly known for his focus on international issues. He served as a member of the House International Relations Committee, where he was the vice chair for 6 years. He also served as chair of both the Asia Pacific Subcommittee and the Europe Subcommittee. He also served nearly 10 years on the House Intelligence Committee, including service as the vice chairman. He was a member of the House Select Committee on Hunger, obviously relevant to today's topic, and he started the USAID Farmers to Farmers program, which provided assistance to farmers in developing countries so that they might develop sustainable practices around food security issues. In 2004, after 26 years in the House, he left Congress and he became president of the Asia Foundation, based here in the Bay Area in San Francisco, which works on a wide variety of development and other projects throughout Asia, and is, I learned this week, is the largest development NGO outside of Washington, D.C., anywhere in the country. He led the Asia Foundation through a period of extraordinary growth until he retired from the Asia Foundation in 2011. So I think all of these experiences, his background coming from an agricultural state, his long experience in Congress focusing on international issues, and his leadership of an NGO focused on international issues, all of these give him a very deep and profound expertise as he addresses today's topic: can the world feed 9 billion people? A global agricultural development initiative. Congressman Bereuter.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time to come this afternoon. How's the mic working in the back row? Is it okay? All right, great. The title of this lecture is focused on the question, as you heard, of whether the world can feed 9 billion people by the year 2050, 2 billion more than we have now. I'll present the case for that global agricultural development initiative that can meet this challenge. And why did I choose this subject, and why me? Of course, this is a public lecture and part of my one-week sojourn on the Berkeley campus that's dedicated to honoring the public service and legacy of my former colleague and congressional classmate and a friend. We use that term loosely on Congress, but this is legitimate use of friendly. A congressman, of course, from Sacramento, who, along with his widow, Representative Doris Matsui, are, as you heard, Berkeley graduates. And we're still continuing to get Doris's Christmas card and trade it with her every year, and I've watched Brian grow up, and they were friends of ours, and she's certainly a friend of ours today. We met each other at what was then a bipartisan orientation session given by the Kennedy School in 1978. That was a good way to start a Congress, I think, a House of Representatives, that unfortunately was ended as a bipartisan effort in 1995. But it was a good start. And Bob and I never had the chance to serve on the same committees, but we did work together on a variety of issues. He was interested in trade, as I was, and certainly we're interested in Asia and U.S.-Asian relations. Bob was a progressive, conscientious, and able, ethical Democrat, and I was his colleague and a friend across the aisle, and we worked together on some amendments that crossed party lines and crossed committee jurisdictions. So I mentioned some of our interests. I remained in Congress, as you heard, until August of 2004, when I retired after 13 terms, 26 years, and came to the Bay Area to serve 6.5 years as the president and CEO of the Asia Foundation. And we have a home in Nebraska, which we've kept, and we live in Alamo part of the time. You can imagine we spend the winters here, and we have that option. And actually, I'm an urban planner by training, the first one ever elected to Congress. And my first job after serving as an Army officer for a couple of years after graduate school was to come here to the Bay Area, where I worked for HUD in the 10-state regional office, and we lived in San Francisco, 3 blocks from the Cliff House. But then I wanted to help somebody get elected governor in my home state, so I returned, and it worked, and I ended up eventually lobbying the legislature, and then decided sometime later that I would run against the incumbent senator in my district, and with my wife's help and others, we won. So that started my unexpected elective life. I chose this topic for the Matsui lecture because, as I will shortly explain, I believe the need for a global food security initiative and poverty reduction is a crucial requirement if we're to avoid a reversal of the recent progress which we made in reducing global hunger and malnutrition and feed an additional 2 billion people who will be added by 2050, primarily in South Asia and also in sub-Saharan Africa. And then I suppose this question, why do I presume to address this topic? Well, It's been an interest of mine, and you heard that I was a charter member of the Hunger Select Committee on Hunger, which was also ended, unfortunately, in 1995. It's worth mentioning, I think, that coincidentally, two of Bob Matsui's classmates, we called that classmates when we came in at the same time into the House of Representatives, different form of classmates, once chaired that Hunger Select Committee. And one was Tony Hall, Democrat of Ohio, who I still work with, and the late Representative Mickey Leland, Democrat of Texas, who died in an African plane crash as a part of committee work. And of course, I served as a congressman, as you heard, from Nebraska, and it is, my district was one of the top 10 agriculture districts in the country, and I have a land-grant institution I have a degree from a land-grant institution like California, like the University of California, Berkeley, and Davis. Now, California, to give it its due, is always number one in agriculture and food production. We've learned that, and I know it's true, but my home state's typically third or fourth, and we follow California in irrigation, only leader. Most of my congressional service was recognized for my involvement in foreign affairs and intelligence initiatives, and I found there was a strong consensus, a strong interest among my citizens in both trade and humanitarian relief, especially emergency hunger relief. Now, I found that as long as I looked after agriculture interests and water issues and some housing issues, they would tolerate my interest in international affairs, especially if I focused a little on the hunger relief issues. So that's what I did. Then to my time at the Asia Foundation and my 6-year chairmanship of the House Asia Pacific Subcommittee gave me plenty of opportunities to see the conditions of abject rural poverty in parts of South and Southeast Asia. Thus, when I was asked in early 2000 by the very well-respected Chicago Council on Global Affairs to be a member of its new 13-member working group on global agricultural development, I began a commitment of substantial time to their effort, which continues to this day. The Council's Global Agricultural Development Initiative program, I'd venture, is unmatched in this country in its examination and promotion of American leadership role in international food security. Their initiative, funded by the Gates Foundation, has had a truly fundamental, important impact on the U.S. government's international food security programs during the last 3 years. I've been fortunate to work with an excellent, dedicated staff there, led by the longtime CEO, Marsha Bhutan, and a working group co-chaired by Dan Glickman, my former colleague as well, Bob's former colleague and the former Secretary of Agriculture, and by Catherine Bertini, the agricultural expert and development expert at the Maxwell School in Syracuse, but she also served as the leader of the World Food Program in Rome. It's enabled me to learn much from them while trying to bring my own professional, congressional, and Asia experience to bear on the subject of global security and poverty reduction. This afternoon, I intend to share with you at least a few of the key findings and the results of this series of working groups effort, and to provide at least a summary of the dimensions and the nature of the global challenge ahead. First, to assist this audience, I'll provide you a brief oral outline of this lecture. My comments begin with a very brief description of the dimensions and impact of the current and future overall food challenges. We're going to then look specifically at challenges caused by access problems, by food price volatility, by climate change, and by the farming conditions and practices of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia and South Asia. And it's those areas where the population suffers, of course, most severely from hunger, and where the level of poverty is the most extreme and pervasive. In the case of Africa, it's also the area where the potential for producing more food and crops is the highest, and improved food security is thought to be the greatest. So I'll follow that with some descriptions of what the U.S. has been doing nationally and internationally on their programs. And here we go. So the heart of the lecture. First, we look at the dimensions and the impact of the global food security challenge. I hope to convince you that there are obvious reasons to be concerned about global food security, a term frequently used today to describe the goal of assuring that all the Earth's inhabitants have minimally enough nutritious and safe food to meet their dietary needs. Unfortunately, that circumstance doesn't prevail today, far from it. For a large share of the world's inhabitants simply do not have even the minimal amount of nutritious and safe food to meet their dietary needs. Mostly they can't afford it, or they can't raise enough for their families if they're subsistence farmers. Incredibly, of the Earth's approximately 7 million inhabitants, nearly a sixth suffer from chronic hunger. A UN Food and Agriculture Organization study indicated that 2 billion people suffer from undernutrition, of which 870 million in developing countries of the world, nearly 1 in 7 people, clearly are unable to afford enough food to lead healthy and productive lives. Additionally, in a report last year, Secretary Clinton indicated that each year 3.5 million children will get sick and die from what she termed undernutrition. And she further posited that undernutrition costs developing countries up to 3% of their annual GNP and places individuals at risk of losing about 10% of their lifetime earning potential. So it's a long-term problem that child undernutrition causes. Now, the working group at the Chicago Council and I suggested that today there are 5 primary reasons for increased concern about global food security, and I'll characterize those concerns as challenges. The first challenge is the challenge of increasing food production itself. First and foremost, according to the UN's Population Division, the world's population is expected to grow 33%, or by 2.3 billion more people by 2050. Secondly, as people's income rises, the dietary preferences and the caloric intake also increases. Third, increased weather volatility, perhaps reflecting the impact of climate change, and resource shortages, particularly water, negatively affect agricultural productivity and predictability. These were among the initial contributing factors to the 2007-2008 food crisis in Asia. And fourth, the UN warns that 25% of the world's farmland is already degraded. Now, numerous groups and studies have concluded that because of these and other factors or trends, the world needs to nearly double its food production by 2050. The FAO, the UN's FAO, raises that figure to the need for a 60% increase because of weather volatility and growing water and other resource scarcities, in addition to the increased growth in population and caloric demands. A 2012 study of a very respected non-governmental organization called Global Harvest Initiative concludes there's a need to increase production by nearly 2% every year, whereas presently it's about 1.5% per year. Africa, it should be noted, is frequently cited as both the continent where agricultural food productivity is the most deficient and the continent that has the greatest potential for gains in productivity and in total tonnage of production. Africa also is said to have the largest amount of remaining 12% of the world's arable land that is currently uncultivated or undercultivated, and that's an estimate of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD. That would still be the case, apparently, even if the area of Africa's most important tropical rainforest is excluded from that definition. So that's the first challenge, raising more food, crops. The second challenge, the challenge posed by access problems. Here are the major types of access problems. First, access problems caused by severe, widespread poverty. Extreme poverty, where an estimated 560 million people are forced to survive on the equivalent of $1.50 a day, or in some cases less than $1 a day, is most pronounced in rural areas. I think we all have a picture of the urban slums of Mumbai or wherever, but actually, according to IFAD, 70 to 80% of the world's poor live in rural areas. Most live on small farms, are women, and rely on subsistence agriculture for their livelihoods. And that, of course, makes them very vulnerable indeed to natural disasters or to dislocation because of violence or armed conflict. A very high proportion of their labor and income must be devoted simply to feeding themselves and their families. For example, the average African family spends half of its income on food, as compared to a 6% share in the United States, 6%. The second type of access problem is caused by inadequate infrastructure, which serves the area of the rural poor. Here, those inadequacies are rather obvious. Poor or non-existent farm-to-market roads and transportation services for delivering crops and receiving supplies, inadequate information and communication technology. There's been some recent progress in a few areas here in Africa I'll talk about later. Severe deficiencies or total absence of agriculture extension services, no modern crop processing facilities, an absence of cooperatives and marketing organizations, and inadequate on-farm, regional, and export storage facilities to reduce the huge loss of production due to spoilage and animal depredation. With respect to these post-harvest losses, for example, some farmers commonly find they lose more than 80% of the market value of their crops because of transportation, spoilage, or depredation, or marketing costs. So post-harvest losses typically can be 50% due to spoilage and transit losses, enough to adequately feed, by the way, an estimated 48 million people. The third type of access problem are governmental trade barriers or trade-related subsidy practices. This problem area is a major one, and in some cases a fundamental impediment to agricultural development for the world's developing countries and their impoverished subsistence farm families. One could surely devote at least several seminars to the subject. Suffice it to say that the production, transportation, and the competitive export subsidies, the nature of the emergency relief programs we have, and the import barriers of the world's developed countries, for example, the European Union countries, the United States, Japan, Brazil, just to name some of the countries, do great damage to farmers and agricultural development programs in the developing world and to their individual farmers. Let's just say that's a fact that's been examined from every direction. There are also volumes that have been written too, outlining a less counterproductive way for delivering foreign and disaster assistance to impoverished citizens of lesser developed countries. That was brought up by a student when I talked to the Cal Forestry group today, you remember, Ethan? She's absolutely right. However, there's another side to the trade barrier problem that's worthy of mention. That is the existence of trade barriers in and among developing countries because of their own laws, their regulations, their own practices. In other words, not all the trade problems affecting lesser developed countries are the result of subsidies or practices of the developed countries. Some are self-inflicted and need to be reduced. For example, a 2012 report concluded that African farmers could largely feed the continent today if agricultural commodities simply flowed more freely within and among African countries. And it should be noted that the increased intracontinental trade of agriculture inputs, such as fertilizers, equipment, and so on, is also important for improving trends of productivity on African farms. The third challenge is the challenge posed by rising commodity prices and food price volatility. The FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, found that the real price of raw agricultural commodities grew 37% between 2005 and 2012, and concluded that there's no relief in sight. The International Food Policy Research Institute projects that the real price of rice, corn, and wheat will likely rise by 25%, 48%, and a whopping 75%, respectively, between 2010 and 2050. Indeed, food price volatility became a widely noted phenomenon in 2008, with food price shocks said to be an initial contributing factor for unrest and violence in over 30 countries, including demonstrations that precipitated or exacerbated civil unrest in several Arab Spring countries. Although its impact of dramatically higher prices was felt worldwide, the most dramatic impacts of soaring prices, hoarding, critical food shortages was seen in Southeast and South Asia in 2007-2008. There, for example, one saw complicating and unnecessary overreactions in the form of national export bans on rice by home countries. A full 1/4 of the world's governments instituted protectionist policies to safeguard production reserves supplies of commodities in 2008, notoriously in India. The use of very precious savings to buy food by poor families drained their still meager resources. Price spikes became common. Malnutrition and hunger rates got a lot worse. National economic recoveries were damaged, and political instability increased. What started as a series of weather disasters came on the back of population increases, higher demands by consumers for food, rising energy costs, and a leveling off of the Green Revolution-driven productivity growth rates, all of which together, in turn, created a man-made level of crisis because of panic-driven governmental intervention. All of these negative results of that food price panic have been documented by the FAO and by experts from such organizations as the International Rice Institute and the Asian Development Bank. Multilateral reforms and increased cooperation are clearly called for to limit the reoccurrence and severity of these devastating food price volatility-driven episodes in the future. Citizens' uprisings caused by food shortages and price shocks exacerbated long-simmering political discontent. It's suggested that in some cases, of course, this was a precipitating fact in several countries that turned quite violent. Clearly, there are national security, defense implications for the United States and other countries that spring from this level of and variety of turmoil. The fourth challenge, the challenge posed by climate change. A few minutes ago, I mentioned climate change as a possible factor in extreme weather patterns that gave the initial impetus to the so-called food crisis. Certainly, climate change deserves to be discussed. I can begin by noting a UN report which forecasts that global climate change will cause a fairly dramatic dislocation or displacement of traditional area crops and the creation of new climate change-related plant diseases and pest problems. Also, a World Bank study concluded that climate change will do 4 things. 1, it will stress ecosystems and water supplies, and that's important since agriculture accounts for the use of 70% share of the fresh water on Earth. Climate change, secondly, will affect weather patterns, including a greater frequency of volatile weather events. Third, climate change will cause likely commodity food price spikes due to more frequent droughts and other extreme weather phenomena. For example, the drought in the Black Sea region resulted in Russian wheat export ban, which caused a worldwide price shock. Examples by some accounts of unusual crop failures in Rwanda of the important Arabica coffee bean crop in Rwanda ignited the tensions that evolved eventually to become the terrible tribal genocide there, and a severe drop in cacao prices helped launch a bloody civil war in the Ivory Coast. And fourth, climate change can undermine, on balance, agriculture productivity, causing an estimated decrease of 16% worldwide by 2080 and a 28% negative impact in Africa. The working estimate used by the Chicago Council Task Force I co-chaired last year estimated the current productivity cost of climate change to the ag sector to be in the range of a negative 5 to 6% already, with a 7% loss in at least a quarter of the world's nations. It would no doubt have even been higher negative impact were it not for real and predicted progress which being made in applied research to seed and plant adaptation. That's happening, thank goodness, and more will happen, we hope. The fifth challenge, and the last one I'll mention, is the challenge posed by farming conditions and practices in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Now, we bring this up specifically because, as I mentioned, this is the area where it has the greatest potential, but also it's got great problems today. There are, after all, this is the area that has population expanding most rapidly, the largest share of the world's poorest people, try to scratch out a meager existence. Parenthetically, I might mention that in speaking, writing, and programming about the location of the poorest people in the world, most people, and I think even our government sometimes, puts the first focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Well, it deserves a focus, but the world's largest concentration, the largest number of the poorest people on earth are located in Northeast India and adjacent areas in Bangladesh. More people who are desperately poor in that area than in all of the sub-Saharan Africa countries combined. How many people really know that? Another reason to identify particular problems or impediments to food production in sub-Saharan Africa, it is the part of the world that most agriculture experts believe to have the greatest potential for expanding agriculture productivity. Actually, Africa could be a significant net food agriculture commodity exporter right now, rather than having its growing inability to feed its existing population as a continent. Yet this subcontinental region is one of the world's areas where agriculture productivity per capita is indeed actually falling. In some countries like Zimbabwe, the reasons are all too obvious. That country, once the breadbasket of southern Africa, is now a basket case because of its leadership. The basic problem of food agriculture productivity in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia perhaps can be most simply described by maybe three factors. One is the small-scale farms that predominate. They have very low productivity, and most are only subsistence farmers. But the size is not the crucial factor. They're not talking about enlarging it and using mechanized equipment. Rather, they lack knowledge and access to alternative crops and improved seed stock. Secondly, there are only very limited localized market opportunities, if any at all, for any excess production they might be producing on those subsistence farms that could be more than subsistence farms. Third, the limiting factors are perpetuated not only by the general ineptitude, inattention, and corruption of so many of their host governments, but more importantly, there's been a 2-decade-long decline in effective support for agricultural development by the nations of the developed world, by bilateral, multilateral donors, by international institutions, and the limited or risk-adverse interest of the private sector. Does it surprise you to learn that the share of ODA, overseas development aid, of the 22 OECD countries, the developed countries of the world, in the 1980s was 11% of their total aid, and that's fallen to 6% in 2008, 2009. Okay, that's the situation. Now for maybe some good news about what's being done just in recent years. In early 2009, the Chicago Council released a report entitled Renewing America's Leadership in the Fight Against Global Hunger and Poverty. And we put it into a form of white paper, and we put it in the hands of the McCain and Obama campaigns in time for them to take it to the platform committees of the two national conventions. The white paper and the aforementioned report subsequently were delivered after the election to the Obama Presidential Transition Organization. It contained 21 very detailed major recommendations. Now, for reasons of time limitation, I'm not going to give you the 21, don't worry, but they fall into 5 categories. Increased support for agriculture, education, extension at all levels in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Second, increased support for agricultural research in those areas. Third, increased support for rural and agricultural infrastructure, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Fourth, improved organization and effectiveness of American and international aid programs, and especially agricultural development. Fifth, reform and or elimination of a variety of specific U.S. trade, subsidy, and aid policies that currently are harmful to agricultural production. Responding, no doubt, to that white paper, but also to the obvious results of the food crisis of 2008, President Obama was motivated and well prepared to announce a global food security initiative at the London G20 summit in early 2009, and then in greater detail at the July 2009 G8 meeting in Italy. Included were specific U.S. pledge that we would provide an additional $3.5 billion of public resources to be provided over 3 years for financing food security initiatives, and that this would in turn ended up being matched internationally by other country donors, by international institutions, and by some private foundations. Another $18.5 billion was pledged for that 3-year period of time. These two summits in 2009 were very important in establishing a framework for coordinated and comprehensive action on global food security among host governments, donors, civil society, the private sector, and other stakeholders. Several months later, in November of that same year, the Rome Food Security Summit, the U.S. was instrumental in the development of 5 key principles that now constitute the International Foundation for collective global action on agricultural development and food security. Today they're known as the Rome Principles. And I put them into your hands as you came in. I hope you have a copy of those 5 sentences. They were unanimously endorsed by the 193 countries in that World Food Summit, and I think they're crucially important. And after that year, at the Pittsburgh Summit of the G20, the developing countries in the G20, that part of them, called for the creation of a global agriculture and food security program, and that resulted in another significant amount of money being pledged primarily by the United States, by Canada, by South Korea, by Spain, and by the Gates Foundation. So that was made available as well, and we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar pot of money there to supplement it. So what did the administration do to implement their pledges? They initiated the Food for the Future program. I'll refer to it as the FTF to save time now. They gave them life in the form of a program, FTF, which was launched by Secretary Clinton in May of 2010 and led by the U.S. Department, the State Department's Agency for International Development. It was meant to be a whole-of-government program, and that's oftentimes very difficult to get all the agencies coordinated and involving that. It's a very difficult task, as many of you know, but the cooperation level between USDA and the State Department, USAID, has been extraordinary. Secretary Vilsack has been very much involved in assisting the State Department and USAID on this effort. So that's what's happened in the last few years in terms of laying things down. The U.S. decided it would focus its resources primarily, although not exclusively, on what are called focus countries. And based on the Rome Principles and the opportunity to implement effectively, 20 countries were selected, and 5 were specifically called Phase 2 countries, the most prepared to move ahead. Each of these countries was asked to develop a country investment plan, CIP is the acronym, for increased agricultural-led growth and enhancing food security in order to attract both external and internal resources and technical support. The 5 of the countries that are Phase 2 are Ghana, Mali, Rwanda, Senegal, and Tanzania. In addition, some funds were made available to other kinds of recipients that would support those 5 and later those 20 countries. So underlying those policies and priorities were the following 3 basic findings. 1, agriculture growth is highly effective in reducing poverty. Every 1% increase in agriculture income per capita reduces the number of people living in extreme poverty by between 0.6% to 1.8%. Second, market-oriented approaches to small-scale agriculture delivers results on a large scale. 3, investing in women farmers is pivotal to achieving results in most countries. For example, in West Africa in particular, as women today produce 60 to 80% of food in these developing countries. 60 to 80%. So equalizing women's access to agriculture inputs and credits, therefore, can increase total national input by an estimated 10%. And it's shown that if increase in the family's income is controlled by women, these earnings are more likely to be spent on food and children's education, health, and health care. It may be by now that all these words I've used to describe the initiatives, the objectives, the principles, the priorities have begun to sound a bit abstract. Therefore, let me give you a few examples, big and small, of things that have come out of this already. First, I'll share a couple of examples from Rwanda, which has the highest population density in Africa. Despite a commendable annual GNP growth of about 6%, its agricultural productivity is extremely low, and thus 60% of its population, mostly engaged in subsistence farming, have incomes below the poverty line, and 40% subsist barely on less than 90 cents a day. The FDF assistance on Rwanda's priorities they set, but we move through an environmental filter to make sure that the impact of projects did not have negative environmental or climate change results. Their priorities include an emphasis on erosion control and improved fertilization practices, along with improved access for poor farmers to financial services through microfinance and USAID loan guarantee programs. Also, since stunting and wasting in children with lifelong impact is the result of malnutrition, concerted nutrition services are being made available for prenatal and postnatal care for children and their mothers, as it also is in Ghana, Bangladesh, and accelerated by USAID in Haiti under this initiative. In Tanzania, PDF and long-term USAID research are developing and propagating, and I doubt if we would have thought of this, but they did, a new variety of easy-to-grow and affordable sweet potatoes, especially rich in beta-carotene, which the human body converts into vitamin A. That is especially important since each year an estimated 50 million African children risk falling into diseases associated with vitamin A deficiencies, also a life-threatening problem for pregnant women. Who knew what a difference this variety of sweet potatoes and a campaign to encourage its propagation would make? Also, on a much larger scale project in Tanzania, FTS embraced their innovative subnational Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor project, which aims to boost agricultural competitiveness. It's designed to foster a public-private partnership to more closely align infrastructure investment and agricultural investment with its new east-west Southern Transportation Corridor. So there's a very specific regional approach that's taken place, and it's being supported not just by us, but by the other donors too, under the Global Agricultural Development Initiative. Here's another very unusual small-scale project, which seems to be something that the people in Mali thought was a good idea, and it seems to be. In Mali, FDF backed one of the country's decisions to reform the way that shallots, vegetables, were grown and marketed. Why? Because the Malian government chose it for the reason that there's a high participation level already by women farmers in shallot production. They traditionally used hand processing and drying methods, which produced low yields, quick spoilage, and poor marketing potential. With new inexpensive processing equipment, improved post-harvest storage, and the creation of a 2,000-member smallholder cooperative, these shallot farmers have boosted their yields dramatically and their sales, and they are innovatively pulling themselves out of poverty. So far, so good. Ghana is recognized for having one of Africa's most impressive annual GNP growth rates, 4 to 8% over the last decade annually, and a reduction in the percentage of poverty from 52% to 28% during that period. However, progress in the northern half of the country has lagged. The gap is said to be widening. In this instance, Ghana's CIP is dedicated to increasing crop production in the northern region where large tracts of land remain underutilized and transportation deficiencies are extreme. There's basically no transportation capacity in many of these areas. Here the investment is infrastructure from several sources, mostly international development institutions, and it focuses on improving the investment climate for agribusiness and developing private partnerships and smallholder linkages. A final example I'll cite is from Bangladesh, one of the countries the Asia Foundation works in most aggressively. The most densely populated Asian country, nearly 160 million people living in an area only as big as Iowa. Its rate of undernutrition is 40%, 50% among females, and the poverty rate is 36%. Since rice is the dominant staple in their diet, the FTF, with the International Rice Institute out of Manila, agreed with the country's CIP by investing in new technologies for rice production and the development and use of a new rice variety that are saline, drought-resistant, and more nutrient-dense. You know, if you had to locate a country somewhere, you wouldn't locate it where Bangladesh is, because they're subject to typhoons and then droughts. And if you look at this as a development specialist, you have to say, you know, if India and Bangladesh and Nepal could ever get together in that incredible river basin, they could all come out a lot better, and you'd have a lot more electricity for one of the poorest regions in the world. But political differences between India and Bangladesh have not made that possible yet. Well, we were supposed to assess the program. That was a part of the effort to see for the pledging funders, what's happening? Is it going well? So with that in mind, the Chicago Council issued a progress report in May of 11, and our advisory group prepared an updated recommendation to the Obama administration later, and we turned it over to them last December. It's being embargoed at this time for what might be a short period of time, but the President has a lot on his agenda right now, and Congress is probably not too ready to take up something anyway. But the 3-year period ends on June 30th of this year. So we needed to pay attention to it and to do what we can to note the achievements and note what remains to be done and emphasize again and again that sustained effort is necessary. In terms of meeting its 3-year U.S. foreign aid pledge of additional $3.5 billion, as well as the other effort under the GADFI, the U.S. has done pretty well. It's come very close to it. It's practically as well, maybe better than any other country at this point. In FY 2012, for example, the appropriation level was $1.049 billion in a very tight fiscal situation. Additionally, separate continuing funding for agricultural research in the U.S. has been increased by $1.8 billion in this past fiscal year. Of course, it should be emphasized that the fight for global hunger and poverty requires not just changes and higher funding levels, which have begun in part. It requires a sustained, long-term global commitment by the U.S. and the major governmental partners and key non-governmental actors. So what are the prospects for continuing? Well, Carol Bellamy, the distinguished former head of UNICEF, and I took it upon ourselves at the suggestion of the Council to do a white paper, making initial assessment and delivering it to the administration as to we got a bit into tactics, and that's why it's embargoed at this point. Where are we today? Well, I am going to conclude basically my remarks by suggesting there are 8 specific ideas or emphasis or priorities that I previously advocated, so I'm not taking anything out of the embargoed report, regarding what should be done by America and directly and in its international role for the Global Agricultural Development Initiative. First, the authorization bill. We need an authorization bill to continue it, to sustain this effort. And it would be great if it was a permanent authorization. That's very difficult, especially right now. But as a minimum, we should shoot for 10 years and settle for no less than 5 years for an authorization bill. And that should shortly be followed by an appropriation bill. The Lugar-Casey bill of 2008, I think, would be a good model to consider for adaptation and adoption by the current 113th Congress. Second, the university's role, and I haven't talked about this, but I feel very strongly about this issue. In any international effort to develop global food security, the United States should surely emphasize those areas where it has a comparative advantage over other nations. Clearly, one of those areas is the unmatched experience, expertise, and extension services in all the areas of agricultural science and food production that one finds among the great land-grant institutions and a few of the other great research universities and institutions within the U.S. government itself, and in the positive forms of symbiotic relationship which exists between the private sector and those entities. This is the advantage that we have. Unfortunately, it's true that the actual public dollars devoted to basic and applied research has declined, and that needs to be reversed. It would surely be advantageous, too, if the level of partnerships, educational exchanges, and joint research programs in the broad array of agricultural, biological, environmental disciplines between American universities and those of developing countries that were once more prevalently the case and better financed in this country could be restored and accelerated. I do remember in the 50s and 60s how land-grant institutions had partner institutions abroad. In some cases, they helped to found them. I'm sure the University of California had some. My home state's university worked in eastern Turkey and Colombia, had a long-term relationship with them, did things in North Africa on certain times of crops. I think those things need to be restored, and they've been neglected for too long. Third, an accelerated priority on science. Although the U.S. may be seeing its stature as a world leader in agricultural sciences and technology shrinking because of declining public funding relative to other countries and so on, it still has a comparative advantage in our science and technology sectors that it should pursue to benefit the International Global Food Security Initiative. It will also provide competitive and economic benefits to our own farmers and our own agribusiness sectors. In fact, it may not be politically wise to say this if I was a farm state legislator yet, but it may be that farm sector needs increased agricultural science funding more than it needs crop subsidies today. Advances in technology, plant science, and efficient water utilization are among the areas of particular importance for production breakthroughs, as well as an enlarged focus on orphan crops, where the private sector research funding is less likely. Even so, it needs to be recognized that today business is responsible for nearly half of the world's agricultural research. Get that? Private sector is responsible for over half. That sector needs to be further incentivized to bring its research and technology to bear on production opportunities for developing countries' farmers, for smallholders, as well as larger domestic ventures. Fourth, a focus on specific technology for smallholder farmers. The development or adaptation of technological innovation for its use by smallholders has to be a priority for public finance research and that of the private sector in America and the world's other technologically advanced countries. Some important technologies can be quite simple, as in the case of the treadle pump, for example, because extending such technology broadly to the isolated smallholder farmers can raise production levels dramatically at little cost. In other cases, we can see that spreading the knowledge and deployment of what some people call disruptive technologies or transformative technological products can indeed transform the way that smallholders farm. Real examples of the common use of such technologies by smallholders is still limited areas of Africa. They're now using cell phones to access banking services, buy crop insurance, check markets, or tap into the extension service advice from public research hubs. Very limited area, but in some countries it's happening now, and it's pretty amazing. This innovation is life-altering for the smallholder farmer, changing a subsistence farm into one that has food for the family and something for export. Fifth, a focus on women farmers. I almost felt that I should have given this talk 2 weeks ago because last week in the New York Times there was an op-ed called The Feminization of Farming, and it was written by UN Rapporteur. Since roughly half of the farming in the developing world, sometimes 70–80% of the crops are raised by women, we need to intensify the food for the future focus and that of other countries on assuring that women have access to necessary and improved agriculture inputs, credit, technology, property rights, and security. Not only will this dramatically increase food production for the farm and the country and family income, there are demonstrated health and education benefits for the family's children. The emphasis must also be a priority for the international and private sector donors. Sixth, the focus on sustainability or resilient intensification. Faced with limited land and water resources and the still uncertain challenges caused by climate change and the global demand for much greater agricultural food production, global agriculture has to be more sustainable and productive. Agriculturalists are beginning to use the term resilient intensification to describe the concept that has to be embraced. The central tenet of that term or concept, I learned, quote, is that agriculture must be more diverse in order to absorb shocks, and as climate change and rising fossil fuel prices, and to fight hidden hunger, which is caused by the lack of essential micronutrients in many staple crops. This means, it goes on to say, that U.S. agricultural science needs to adapt to it and adopt a global perspective, and to improve seeds and plant varieties, for example, for far more types of crops. Seventh, the reform of trade. Bob, I think, would like it if I focus on this. We need to have unfettered movement of food and agricultural products, and the U.S. needs to re-examine its trade barriers there. This is one of the most difficult things to change, of course. Eighth and finally, a motivated private sector. I must not neglect to say what's obvious. The funding and reform of the public sector's effort in a global agricultural development initiative is not alone enough to make it a success. It will take the huge investment by the world's private sector with complementary action by the philanthropic and NGO sectors to meet the global food challenges. The resources, the managerial skills, the general history of the rapid deployment of innovative technology by the private sector dwarfs what the public sector can bring to the table. What's essential, of course, is to convince and to motivate the private sector that the entrepreneurial risk and potential rewards make their energetic involvement and investment in focused countries an inviting business opportunity, and of course to keep their commercial and investment decisions significantly focused on improving farming profitability of the smallholder farmer. Alternatively, if this priority on the smallholder farmer is neglected and the engaged private sector's dominant investment and other business decisions are perceived to be directed to large-scale corporate farming, it will only lead to a decline in the global support for the initiative and to political turmoil, higher unemployment, a widening income gap in the countries targeted for external assistance. So, you've heard about the challenge, you've heard about some recent progress. What can I say to cap this off? To succeed, this truly needs to be a concerted global effort. Therefore, for example, it's clear, I believe, that more must be expected of the BRIC countries and other capable nations. For example, China should be asked to do more on a cooperative basis and encouraged to better use of its very large external finance resources and to reform its current aggressive, exploitive, and self-serving development model. India, speaking bluntly, must begin to energetically address its own huge domestic hunger and poverty problems. It should do so out of a sense of national conscience and with the recognition that its cultural norms and dysfunctional governmental institutions are major contributing factors to a wholly inadequate national response to its problems, the problems of its impoverished citizens. The U.S. must marshal and concentrate its effort on the areas where it has comparative advantage. It doesn't make sense for us to focus on physical infrastructure. Let the World Bank, the regional development banks in China do that. We need to focus on where we have the comparative advantage. It will make our dollars go further and also. So there are crucial leadership resources that need to be brought to bear. If the United States does not sustain its effort, this won't get done. We've met challenges before. We can meet this one. The question I leave you with is, will world leaders, institutions, and informed citizens act on the basis of the emerging evidence of the accelerating food security problems in the existing demography of Africa, of South Asia, and parts of Latin America? I leave you with that huge question. Thank you for your attention.
So we have a little bit of time for questions. We have two microphones, one in each aisle. Raise your hand, and we want to keep the questions relatively brief. So please ask a short question. We will get more of them in. Even there's a woman right next to you. We'll start there. Brief question.
Hi, thank you, Congressman Bereuter. We really appreciate your comments. I had a question in terms of adding the United States agricultural industry into the global food initiatives. There were 4 programs at one point, or 4 issues that I wanted to raise. One was under the 1984 Reagan administration, Iowa farmers and farmers in that belt were given subsidies to plow under their crops in order to keep the cost of corn high. Secondly, there was a suit in 2009 by the Black Farmers and Agriculturalists Association, which was decided in their favor under Pigford versus the United States Department of Agriculture. Those plaintiffs have as yet not been paid for the farms that they lost due to Department of Agriculture's negligence. The third thing is that in California, the organic farmers are, the organic farmers in California are under threat from several items in the Obama administration's legislation from last year regarding home gardening. And then lastly, the University of California, our own university, had a program in the 1970s and 80s in Los Angeles, which actually was run by the Extension, which allowed neighborhoods to take vacant lots and turn them into community farms. I wanted to know if any of those programs will be affected positively by the global initiative.
The global initiative is addressed for efforts abroad. The latter subject you bring up is not a new initiative in some ways. It was done during World War II. It is effective in producing more food. The first item you mentioned, I think, is accurate. The problem is, in part, the instability in our farm programs. There was also a period not too long after that, and continued for quite some period of time, when farmers were encouraged by the program to farm fence row to fence row. And much land that had been in conservation practice was taken out. It happened in my district. It happened in many places. Center Pivot made it possible to farm land that should not have been farmed in a conservation sense. With respect to black farmers, you accurately point out the lawsuit and the results and the causes of it. I was unaware they haven't been paid yet, but I'll take your word for that.
Actually, we'll go back there. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your excellent talk. You mentioned one of the pillars of the solution is increasing agricultural production. And presumably it matters where, especially with all the market failures in food insecure countries. And I wanted to ask, what is the role of increasing agricultural production in the United States in meeting the food security challenge?
There is a potential, certainly, for increasing food production. I think we're going to continue to see additional production. We're going to see some displacement of crops, no doubt, from one region to another. This is going to create some problems. As I mentioned, it may cause some pest problems as well. So you'll find things that are grown farther down in the southern Great Plains are moving northward. So you're going to have a significant change, I think, brought on by climate change. Overall, the production is continued to expected to increase, especially because of the work that's being done by plant geneticists and by adaptation of plants and seeds to climate conditions. So this kind of research, which is a combination of public and private research, is going to continue to increase production in this country. There are questions, of course, about use of crops for food versus crops for energy.
Maybe there's a man in a blue shirt who's had his hand. Yeah, right there. Actually, she'll bring you a microphone if you don't mind.
I wonder if you could speak about whether there are realistic prospects for the change in subsidy policies. As you alluded to, they are counterproductive in the extreme. I was in northern Ethiopia at one point, seeing farmers eke out a living on denuded lands, and contiguous to us were big sacks of AID donated surplus American, products. And as a former business executive before I retired, I always thought it's very hard to compete against free, and that's what we were asking the Ethiopian farmers to do.
Well, it's a big challenge, but I would say that for the first time I hear serious discussion, including a discussion on Capitol Hill. It's brought on by our fiscal problems and by our budgetary problems, but I hear discussion now in a substantive fashion by responsible people, some are influential, to begin to reduce dramatically food subsidies. I think to do this, you really need to have a concerted effort between the European Union and the United States, because much of America's subsidies are counteractive to European policies. And no one subsidizes their farmers more than the Europeans. And in the Europeans, of course, are split themselves on this, with France as the country that pushes hardest to continue subsidies, especially for wheat production. But I do think now, more than any time in my life as in public policy, I see more realistic, I would say not realistic, more serious discussion about reducing subsidies and diverting it to other purposes or simply reducing it altogether. I can't tell you how much money the farmers in my district have made the last 2 or 3 years. I no longer hear farmers complaining, which is really remarkable. And of course it's driving land prices just through the ceiling. We've gone through that episode before, though.
David, there's a. Oh, okay, yeah.
Not.
Yeah, how about the young lady over
And
there?
Dick, I know about those bags of seed and how we have wasted money by sending it to Egypt in the same way.
Hi. What do you believe should be the role of GMOs in increasing food production?
Well, there's nothing like a controversial question from the audience. I have battled the European Parliament on this subject. I think that the GMOs responsibly employed are very important to raising food production in the world. And I resent and I'm unhappy about the blackmail the European Union countries place on African countries in that respect. We have been doing things like GMOs and modification for a long time in this country, even in areas of hybridization of our seeds and our crops. So this is nothing new, except it's caught a lot of people's attention, and they have fears because of some things that they have seen happen. I think it's crucial we have to continue to see this employed as a resource. I'm not standing for election.
You pleaded earlier for concerted global effort. As a matter of fact, there is such concerted global effort going on. The framework for it was set up when 69 nations in 2008 ratified the IASTD, International Agricultural Assessment for Science and Technology for Development. This report that was developed over 4 years by over 400 experts around the world was given a second life in the Rio Summit last June, when a chapter on sustainable agriculture was included in the outcome document, and some implementation is now taking place under the umbrella of the Council on Council on Food Security under the name of Changing Course in Agriculture. How do you regard this effort? Do you have any conversation with the organizations involved with this?
No, I don't, but we have people on the task force who are very much involved in that, European and Latin American involved in that issue from one of the universities in this country. So that is a factor in our consideration, and it's a positive factor. That initiative is a positive factor, in my judgment.
Right next to you is a gentleman who's had his hand up for a long time. Then we'll go back there.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned a couple things in your wonderful analysis and observations that I want to follow up on. One was you mentioned India needing to take care of its poor and hungry, and of course there has been reports even last week that 25% of American children are food insecure. And I'm wondering how much is this agricultural policy, or how much of it is, in your opinion, related to politics and economics, and which routes do we take? The other one is you mentioned several times the importance of small farmers. At one point you were talking about the partnership between small farmers and agribusiness. Of course, we go back to plantation agriculture a couple hundred years. But there's now this resistance to so-called land grabs, which is taking place in Papua New Guinea and Tanzania and Brazil and all over the world, and India. I wonder if you could comment on the path to take in that problem too.
Well, one of the reasons I gave the warning is if it's seen as going for large-scale corporate farming, you won't have the support of the general global public. It needs to be, it's difficult, but it needs to make sure that there continues to be a focus on smallholders on the part of corporate investment. But the private sector needs to know that there is profit to be made in the process. And most of the profit, in my judgment, is made by suppliers, not necessarily people directly involved in production itself. That's the niche for business that is less likely to be a negative kind of reaction.
Can anything be done about that land if it's not following the path you recommend?
Well, of course, the pressure that can be brought to bear on the recipient countries is crucial if they want to have this international assistance and the private sector investment that comes with that designation. That's an important factor. I could give you examples of what's happening to tropical forests in other areas in Southeast Asia, where they're being turned into plantations for palm oil and so on. And that's not private sector doing that. That's China doing that. And it's causing deep resentment in Laos, and it's displacing people in Cambodia who have no resources in the first place.
David, back there, yeah.
That was an excellent talk, Congressman Bereuter. We really appreciated it. I know that you care a lot about farmer-to-farmer extension and how small farm productivity can be improved by having innovative farmers teach and guide and show other innovative farmers. And yet that type of extension has very little funding these days. It hasn't been scaled up, and not just within the United States, but south to south type of farmer exchanges and extension. And I'm just wondering whether you've given any consideration to how we can scale up that type of extension.
Don't mean to have this a long-winded answer, but I went to Central America in the 80s a lot, and I saw that the land for the tiller program in El Salvador was failing. Not only a lack of access to credit, but the people coming off these large cooperative farms, that's a very different type of farm than our cooperatives, didn't know how to raise poultry, didn't know how to raise swine. And I thought if I could bring 40 of my farmers down here as volunteers in the winter, we could turn this around. And to my surprise, I came back to Washington and found out that the legislation for the farmer-to-farmer program had been authorized about 10 years earlier, but never funded. So I looked for an innovative way to do it, and we tapped 0.1% of the CCC proceeds. And when the Soviet Union collapsed and people looked around for what could be done to help those countries who were Warsaw Pact countries under Soviet domination, and in the Soviet Union itself, in the republics of Baltic, it was enhanced to about 0.3 to 0.4%. But what this relies on, of course, is volunteers, farmers, retired, active, land-grant institution, faculty, retired faculty, extension service, people to give their time. I had to convince USAID, and it took me a year and a half, you don't have to pay these people, that American volunteerism is alive and well. Just give them a round-trip ticket and a sponsor there. And so far, we've sent about 8,000 or 9,000 people. Many cases, it's 8 or 9 different trips that they've taken, and they come back goodwill ambassadors for the United States. They come back with a community behind them in many cases because they were dairy farmers, and the whole community helped milk their cows when they were gone, and husbands and wives go as pairs and so on. They come back through my office, and it says the greatest experience of my life, you know, and tears coming out of their eyes, long-term relationships form, the best foreign aid program buck for buck that we had. So it's important that we enhance it because volunteerism is alive and well. And what do we have more than anything else in this country as an asset? Skilled people and people who are willing to give their time. So I'm a believer in it, you can tell. And they named the program for me when I left Congress.
Hi, thank you very much. This has been very interesting. The title was Can the World Feed 9 Billion People? And you mentioned that the 9 billion is based on UN projections. I want to bring up the point that those projections by some experts, including here at UC Berkeley, are overly optimistic and rely on fertility.
Which way?
They rely on fertility rates falling. In other words, there's a lot of evidence to show that it will be more than 9 billion, so that the appropriate planning needs to be done, and family planning should be integrated into agricultural activities as well. So I just want to mention that there is an initiative on campus called the OASIS Initiative, which you can find online, which is with the College of Natural Resources, the Bixby Center for Population Health and Sustainability, and the Lawrence Berkeley Lab to look at the interrelatedness and the need for urgent action on scale in order to feed people and to meet unmet need for family planning. I'm wondering if amongst these, the programs, the country programs that you mentioned, are there any family planning activities integrated with those in those countries?
In the focus countries, I'm unaware that they have at this point, especially the 5 early priority focus countries. But you're right in bringing up this point. These projections are not too high, probably. They may be too low. I don't think they're Malthusian, on the other hand, either. So you're right in bringing this up. It seems like 9 billion is at least minimally what the population is going to be like in 2050. It could be higher. The birth rate is falling dramatically in a few countries. I was amazed to find the highest fertility rate in the world is, guess where? Afghanistan. I mean, in the midst of all that.
Let's do one more very brief question. David, there's a woman right there in the middle with her hand up.
So you mentioned before that one of the biggest issues was corrupt government. What role do you think the governments that are receiving aid need to play in order to promote agricultural growth, like particularly?
Well, they're not going to be selected, first of all, if they have a reputation of being terribly corrupt or corrupt. So they're going to lose the status for additional assistance. That's why targeted assistance, not just by the U.S., but by this combination of resources, is important. But I think it takes continued aggressive concern on the part of that government and the funders to make sure that it does not increase. That's about all you can say, I think, in that respect. The original focus countries, 5 are better countries in that respect. I know they went through a careful process of selecting these, but I think there are at least 2 there that were questionable. They were done for political reasons. And you can probably guess which one of them is. But it's not at this point targeted for assistance in what's called phase 2 countries. But it is a huge, huge problem that you bring up. Corruption is endemic in some countries. One of the Asia Foundation's primary emphasis on economic reform is just to deal with the corruption issues. So you have some countries, a limited number, that really have aggressive efforts within the government to ferret out corruption and deal with it. But it's very few. You have a few good examples in Southeast Asia.
As I mentioned, we have a reception set up just outside the hall in the atrium. I hope you'll join us. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, ask it now. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you.